I wanted to ask, which is kind of following up on some of the things you said without being too straightforward, I suppose, which is this concern with economic inequality as required for freedom in a certain line of argumentation that you were trying to push against.
Right.
Right? To now say, well, we need to understand and think afresh, it seems to us today, the relationship between a certain conception of liberty, or liberty in general, and economic equality, which you're doing now. And I wonder, to relate back to the question of the tradition, why do you think it is that you have to be making that intervention now? As in, why do you think it is that neo-republican political theory, perhaps, has neglected this, what I see you saying, as a very tight and necessary relationship between their view of liberty as non-domination and this amount of material inequality? Maybe you could say something about that.
Well, so if I understand it correctly, your question is why does this need to be said at all? There's been a lot of interest in the history of freedom, and people working from within the neo-republican tradition have already made this point that freedom can be identified with popular self-government. So what are you bringing to the table? Is that your question?
In a way, I would invite you to articulate that for others that are watching. I think that you are bringing something to the table that isn't there, so I don't want to be seen as pushing you that way. I wonder why you think it is the case that that opportunity for you to make that intervention has arisen the way that it's arisen. Why have we left the economy out of the story? Would be another way of putting what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Well, so I think there's two reasons for that. First, I think there's a sort of dominant liberal tradition which has really pushed the idea that freedom and equality, in a sense of material equality, so equality of goods, of property, are incompatible values, and if you want to promote the one, you'll be harming the other. So that's sort of Berlinian liberalism. But obviously, I'm not the first person to criticize Berlinian liberalism and to say, perhaps we should be looking at this other tradition of thinking about freedom, which most theorists and intellectual historians call Republican. So I'm building, obviously I'm sort of building on work done by these scholars, in particular Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit. I do feel, however, that both Skinner and Pettit haven't paid as much attention as the sources warrant to the fact that these Republican thinkers weren't just arguing, if you want to be free, you need to have institutions that allow the people to check those who are governing, so you need to create more accountable, more democratic regimes, but that they were also arguing you need more, you need laws and institutions that will make sure that there won't be any rampant economic inequality, because if you have rampant economic inequality, then your democratic Republican government will end up sort of falling apart, either because it becomes an oligarchy or because it ends up sort of falling apart through a civil war. And I think people like Skinner and Pettit haven't paid as much attention as they could have to that sort of argument within the Republican tradition, because they were so intent on differentiating Republicanism from what you might call Aristotelianism. So from the argument that being free isn't about non-domination, but it's about living a particular way of life, and that hence the state can set you free by forcing you to follow that particular way of life. So that tradition, so if you look at both Skinner's and Pettit's work, they've both made it very clear that the Republicanism they're interested in is very different from that Aristotelian concept. And I think there's sort of an unacknowledged assumption that arguments for redistribution and for enhancing equality, is something that fits into that Aristotelian tradition rather than into the Republican tradition that scholars like Skinner and Pettit were interested in. So I think
Mhm.
sort of a desire to dissociate republicanism from Aristotelianism.
Yes. Okay.
And that's also very obvious if you, to my knowledge, the scholar who's done most work on the history of sort of this push for material equality within the Republican tradition is Eric Nelson, and he reads this as being part of an Aristotelian tradition rather than from the Neo-Roman tradition,
Right. Okay.
which is a view that I disagree with.
Okay.
I mean, one of the interesting things about the paper that you're going to be presenting tomorrow, or something like is that, I mean, one way you can go down is to criticize republicanism for just leaving out the economy. But what you're doing is actually just saying, well, actually, if we go back to a lot of these Republican orders, the economy is there.
Right, yes,
And that's
very
what-
much so,
yeah,
very much
yeah.
so. If you, I mean, it is actually surprising that there hasn't been paid more attention to this, because if you read Harrington, and everybody agrees Harrington is sort of, the founding father of republicanism in many ways. I mean, definitely on a par with Machiavelli. He's very explicit about this. His argument is that you need two things. You need rotation, which means an accountable government, but you also need an agrarian law, which is laws that are instituted to redistribute economic wealth among all the individuals in society.
So in this way, it sounds like what you're offering, in one sense, is an internal criticism of neo-republicanism by taking on many of their own positions, but also their own methodology in some sense as well, right? To go back and read the texts a little more
Right.
closely.
I mean, so neo-republicans are very explicit about the fact that they want to place themselves into a particular tradition. That they don't want to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. But surprisingly, they haven't paid that much attention to this particular aspect of their own intellectual tradition.
Okay.